I left the house on a night that felt deliberately quiet, as if the world itself had agreed not to witness what was happening. Sky was clear, no clouds, no moon. Just an empty stretch of darkness that looked endless and indifferent. Remember standing in the hallway, longer than necessary, my hand resting on the strap of my bag, my breath shallow, my body frozen. In that fragile moment between leaving and staying, was not waiting for permission. I was waiting for resistance, a voice behind me, a step on the stairs, my name spoken with urgency, or even Andrew. Nothing would have been enough to make me hesitate, but the house remained silent, not the peaceful kind of silence, but the kind that feels practiced, trained, as if silence had been chosen deliberately. Because it was easier than confrontation, I realized then that no one was counting my footsteps. No one was measuring the distance between me and the door. No one was afraid of losing me. The door closed with a soft click. So soft it startled me, because it sounded final. Too final for something that was supposed to matter. Stood outside for a moment, the cold air pressing against my skin, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure someone inside could hear it. No one. Kamith, that was the moment I understood. Something that would take me years to fully accept. I had not escaped. I had been released the way people release things they no longer need. Quietly, without ceremony, without regret. As I walked away, the house grew smaller behind me, not because of distance, but because of perspective. I had spent my entire childhood believing that place was large and powerful, that it defined me, that it could erase me if I displeased it. But that night, with every step I took, it lost its weight. Still my legs trembled, not from fear of the dark, but from the realization that I was truly alone. For the first to me, no parents to disappoint, no rules to follow, no place to return to. Freedom did not feel like relief. It felt like exposure. Carried only what I could fit in a small bag: clothes, documents, and the quiet conviction that if I stayed, I would disappear in a slower and more painful way. Did not cry because crying felt like a request, and I had stopped asking for anything. That night, as I walked into a future I could not imagine, I made myself a promise I barely understood. If I ever returned, it would not be as someone seeking shelter, but as someone carrying answers. After that night, my life stopped having clear beginnings and endings. Days no longer opened like doors. They simply happened, one after another, quietly, without asking if I was ready. Learned very quickly that the world does not notice you unless you demand to be seen. And demanding requires energy, hope, a belief that being seen will not cost you more than it gives. Had none of those things, so I chose another skill. I learned how to disappear. Disappearing does not mean becoming invisible. It means becoming acceptable, harmless, easy to overlook. I kept my head down, my voice low, my presence small. I took jobs that required no explanation. Cleaning offices after midnight, washing dishes in kitchens that smelled of old oil and tired hands, sorting boxes in warehouses where no one cared what your name was as long as your fingers moved fast enough. People rarely looked at my face. They looked at my hands, my speed, my silence. Seemed I was very good at silence. At night, I rented rooms that were never meant to feel like home. Thin walls, creaking floors, beds that belonged to dozens of bodies. Before Monet learned the sounds of other people's lives through those walls: arguments, laughter, televisions playing shows I would never watch. He learned that everyone carries their own chaos and that mine was not special enough to be acknowledged. I imagined my adoptive parents sitting in their familiar living room. The same furniture, the same routines, the same controlled conversations. He wondered if my absence had required adjustment or if it had slipped into their lives like a missing object they only realized was gone when they needed it. There were nights when my chest tightened at the thought that I might have been forgotten completely, but there were also nights when that idea felt like relief. Being forgotten meant no expectations, no disappointment, no constant sense of failing a test I never signed up for. I stopped introducing myself with my full name. Sometimes I used a shortened version, sometimes a fake one. Ams felt temporary. Anyway, watched people closely, not because I trusted them, but because observation felt safer than participation. I noticed how kindness often came with conditions, how generosity expected gratitude, how sympathy disappeared the moment it became inconvenient. He learned that most people are not cruel. They are simply selective about where they place their carry. I learned that I had never been selected. There was a woman I worked with once, older, sharp-tongued, tired in a way that sleep could not fix. She told me one night while we scrubbed floors side by side, that disappearing was a skill, not a failure, Ash said. People like us survive because we learn how to exist without demanding. Spacey did not ask who she meant by us, but I carried her words with me. Weeks turned into months. Months into something heavier. I stopped counting time because counting reminded me that I was waiting. And I did not want to admit what I was waiting for. I told myself I was building something. Independence, strength, distance from the girl who had stood in that hallway waiting for a voice. But there were moments, rare and dangerous moments, when exhaustion stripped away my defensements, when I sat on the edge of a borrowed bed and wondered if I disappeared entirely, would anyone notice before it was too late? Those thoughts scared me, not because they were dramatic, but because they were calm. Calm thoughts are the most dangerous. Oneso. I kept moving. New jobs, new rooms, new cities that blurred together. I became very good at leaving before anyone learned enough about me to ask questions. I told myself this was freedom, but freedom without connection begins to feel like floating, and floating too long makes you forget what ground feels like. It was during one of those drifting periods when my life felt suspended between effort and emptiness that chance found meant with drama, not with signs, but with something so ordinary it almost felt like a jokey. A small store, bright lights, a counter cluttered with candy and receipts. I bought a lottery ticket because it cost almost nothing, and because routine can sometimes feel like hope when real hope is too heavy to carry. Did not imagine winning. I did not imagine change. I imagined nothing. And that is why it worked. When I checked the numbers days later, I did it absent-mindedly, standing near a window. The city moving around me. First match did not register. Neither did the second. Be the third. My breath caught. I checked again. Slowly, carefully. The world did not stop. Cars kept passing. People kept walking, but something inside me went very still. $1,000,000. The number did not feel real. It felt symbolic, like a sentence written in a language I had not learned yet. I did not feel happy. I felt exposedmony has a way of illuminating everything it touches, especially the past. Suddenly, every memory rearranged itself. Every silence, every conditional kindness, every moment I had been made to feel replaceably. The question was not what I would do with the money. That was Esai's real question, was what the money would force me to see. Sat on the floor that night, back against the wall, ticket in my hand. He thought about the house, the hallway, the quiet click of the door. He thought about answers that had been withheld, about documents I had never seen, about a story of my life that had started long before I was old enough to ask questions. He understood then that disappearing had protected me, but it had also kept me from the truth, and I knew with a certainty that frightened me, that the money was not an escape. It was a return driven by longing, but by power. For the first time I would walk back into that house without fear of being sent away. For the first time I would not need their approval to exist, and that made all the difference. He slept very little that night, not because I was excited, but because excitement implies anticipation. What I felt was preparation, the kind that happens before a storm, when the air grows heavy and everything seems to be holding its breath. I did not tell anyone about the money, not because I was afraid they would take it, but because I wanted to hear the world without it for a little. Longersolence changes when you know something others do not. It becomes thicker, more deliberate, as if every interaction is being weighed against a future that has not arrived yet. He went to work as usual, cleaned the same floors, washed the same dishes, stood in the same lines. Nothing around me changed, but everything inside me did. He watched people speak to me the way they always had, quick glances, neutral tones, polite indifference, and I realized something unsettling. This was how the world treated me when I was worth nothing to it. Thought did not hurt. It clarified. Many had not entered my life yet, but it had already separated it into before and after. I moved through my days with a strange calm, as if I were observing a play whose ending I already knew. At night I sat alone and planned, not how to spend the money, but how to keep it from spending me, because money is not dangerous when you have it. It is dangerous when people know you have it. I opened a new bank account. I memorized numbers. I learned words like anonymity and discretion as if they were shields, but no matter how carefully I planned, there was one thing I could not avoid: the pull backward. The house, the hallway, the silence that had shaped my understood then that the money was not asking me what I wanted. It was demanding a confrontation. Others live where the questions were buried and mine were buried. Thuray booked a ticket, not telling myself I was going home, only that I was going back. The difference mattered in the train. I watched reflections pass in the window, my own face layered over landscapes that felt both foreign and familiar. I wondered if they would recognize me, not my face, but my presenti wondered if the house would feel the same, or if distance had changed it. More than memory suggested when I arrived, I did not go there immediately. Walked the streets instead, the ones that had once defined the limits of my world. Of everything looked smaller, less significant, as if the place itself had aged while I had been gone. People passed me without recognition, and I was grateful that night. I slept in a hotel alone, listening to unfamiliar plumbing sounds and steady traffic. Rehearsed nothing. I planned no speeches. I wanted the truth. Unfiltered, raw, unprepared. The next morning, I stood across the street from the house. It looked exactly as it always had, and nothing like I remembered. Houses do not change much, but the meaning we assign to them does. Crossed the street slowly, each step measured not from fear, but from awareness. This time I was not arriving empty. Handedi knock had the door opened and the air shifted. My adoptive mother stood there, older, thinner, her eyes sharp with surprise. For a moment she did not speak, then she said my name softly, as if testing whether it still belonged to me. Behind her my adoptive father appeared, his posture stiff, his gaze calculating. They did not ask why I was there. They did not ask where I had been. They asked how long I would stay. Stepped inside and the house swallowed me wholly. Everything smelled the same: polish, old fabric, control. We sat at the table, the same table where I had once learned how to speak carefully. Their questions were polite, measured, safe. They asked about work, about health, about nothing. That Moderetti answered briefly, honestly, without offering anything extra. They were watching me, both of them, searching for signs of what I was not. Cerise. Silence between us was different from the silence I remembered. This one was nervous. They sensed something had shifted, even if they did not yet know what. When my adoptive father finally asked how I had managed on my own, his voice carried a curiosity that felt unfamiliar. He said I managed it. It was a new. He did not mention the money, not yet. He wanted to see who they were before it entered the room that evening. My adoptive mother cooked more than necessary, asked if I was eating enough, touched my arm in gestures that felt newly learned. He watched her hands, noting how carefully she placed affection, as if afraid it might be rejected later. When I was alone in my old room, I opened drawers I had not touched in years. Everything was exactly where I left it, or at least where they had decided it should remain. He found old documents, envelopes, papers I did not recognize. He did not read them, yet some truths demand Timming Gover. The next few days, their behavior shifted. Subtly they asked my opinion more often. They spoke about the future as if I were included in it. Still no apologies, no acknowledgement. She were building something new on top of something unresolved. And then, inevitably, the question came. My adoptive father asked how I planned to support myself long term. His tone casual, but his eyes alert. He looked at him, really looked at him, and understood that this moment would change everything. He told them it dramatically, not prudely. Said I had come into some money. The silence that followed was immediate and complete. My adoptive mother inhaled sharply. My adoptive father leaned back in his chair. They asked how much. He told them $1 million. The house reacted before they died, as if walls themselves had shifted. Their faces changed, not with joy, but with recognition. Everything that followed, the kindness, the concern, the sudden warmth, it all began there. That night I lay in bed listening to the house breathe. He understood something with terrifying clarity. Money had entered the room, and nothing would ever be honest again. The morning after the money entered the house, I woke up to a silence that felt staged, not empty, not natural, but arranged like furniture moved slightly out of place. Me adoptive mother was already awake in the kitchen making breakfast she had never made before. Food I used to ask for and had been told was unnecessary. Smiled when she saw me, a careful smile, one that asked a question without asking it. Did you sleep well? He said. Yes, nodded, as if that answer mattered more than it ever had. Me adoptive father arrived later, dressed neatly, too neatly for a normal day, as if appearance had suddenly become important. They spoke to each other with a politeness I had never witnessed, each sentence measured, each glance checked. He realized they were no longer speaking only to each other. They were performing, and I was the audience. They could not afford to lose if he asked nothing directly, but everything they did carried intention. Would I like tea or coffee? Was the room comfortable enough? Did I need anything? At anything word hung in the air. He began to understand that pretending nothing had happened was their way of surviving. What had? They could not face the past, so they rearranged the present. They did not say welcome home. They said stay as long as you like. And that was the first lee because it suggested choice when what they really wanted was assurance. Even the next days the house transformed subtly. New groceries appeared. Repairs long postponed were suddenly urgent. Neighbors visited more often. My name was spoken with pride, with emphasis. This is our daughter's sentence felt heavy, not because it was untrue, but because it was suddenly usefully listened from doorways, from hallways, from the quiet corners I had mastered as a child. Their stories about me changed depending on the listener. Sometimes I was brave. Sometimes I was talented. Sometimes I was always destined for Marie Oasis. If destiny had not once been a disappointment, they never asked where the money came from, as if knowing too much might make it fragile. Instead, they asked about plans, investments, security. They spoke about the future with a confidence that did not belong to them. He answered carefully, never fully, never falsely, because I wanted to see how far they would go without being invited. At night, alone in my room, I examined the house as if it were a body, searching for scars, for evidence of what had been hidden. I opened drawers, looked behind shelves, found old folders labeled with words that meant nothing to me. Yet one night, I found a key taped inside a book my adoptive mother had once told me not to touch. Key was small, unmarked. He did not use it immediately. Discoveries lose their power if rushed during the day. My adoptive mother touched me often, my arm, my shoulder, my hair. Physical affection she had once rationed. Carefully spoke about, worry about, fear about how difficult it had been to let me go. I watched her mouth form these words and wondered how many times she had practiced them in silence. My adoptive father became generous in his own way, offering advice, introductions. Ideas spoke of opportunity, as if it were something he had always understood. They were not pretending I had never left. They were pretending they had never pushed me out. Difference was crucial. One afternoon, a neighbor congratulated them on raising such a successful child. My adoptive mother smiled, tears in her eyes. He stood beside her, feeling like a mirror held up too close. That night, I used the key, opened a drawer in my adoptive father's study, one I had never been allowed near. Inside were documents old, carefully preserved adoption records, legal correspondence, bank statements. Did not read everything, only enough to know there were names I did not recognize, dates that did not align, payments that did not make sense. Suddenly the house felt smaller, tighter. Lies were no longer abstract. They had weight, paper. Inky closed the drawer carefully, locked it, returned the key. Nothing in the house noticed. The next morning, breakfast was even more elaborate, voices even warmer. They were trying harder, and that told me everything, because people only try this hard when they are afraid of losing control, afraid of exposure, afraid of the truth. Walking out the door with its own money and its own name, I realized then this was not a reunion, it was a negotiation, and I had not yet revealed my terms. Something inside me changed after I found the documents. Not loudly, not dramatically, but with a quiet precision that frightened me. Before that moment, I had been a witness. After it, I became a participant, understood that power in this house no longer belonged to history, it belonged to perception, and perception could be shaped. Began to speak less, but when I did, I chose my words carefully, placing them like small weights on a scale. I asked questions that sounded innocent, about investments, about trust, about how they had managed finances when I was young. My adoptive father answered eagerly, too eagerly, his voice confident, but his explanations rehearsed. My adoptive mother watched me constantly, as if afraid I might disappear again. This time, taking something important with Methy, began to ask permission without realizing it. Would you like us to renovate the living room? Do you think it would be wise to speak to a financial advisor? We were thinking perhaps you might want to manage things differently. Nodded or said I would think about it. Indecision became my weapon. He noticed how quickly their moods adjusted to mine, how a smile from me softened the room, how my silence tightened. I did not raise my voice. I did not make demands. Simply existed as someone who could leave. That was enough. Neighbors began to visit more frequently. Friends from their past, people who had never acknowledged me before. They looked at me with curiosity, with admiration, with something like envy. My adoptive parents introduced me proudly, always mentioning my success, always emphasizing resilience, never once mentioning why it had been necessary. Listen to their stories about my childhood. The more comfortable they became, the more careless the house grew. Carelessness leaves Trichesi began to notice details I had once been trained to ignore. A hesitation before certain names, a glance exchanged when specific years were mentioned. The way my adoptive father avoided speaking about hospitals, about paperwork, about the months surrounding my arrival, did not ask direct questions, triggered defense. Instead, I asked sideways. He asked about renovations that happened before I was adopted, about moves, about financial stress during those years. Me adoptive mother answered with vague warmth. My adoptive father answered with precision that felt rehearsed. Their answers did not mismatch is where truth hides late. One afternoon while they were out, I returned to the study, this time with intensity. Spread the documents across the desk. Photographs on my phone, notes in my MIND adoption records, medical references, legal letters, and then something small, almost insignificant, caught my attention. A name. Not my adoptive parents, not Mania woman. Her name appeared once, then again, always followed by redactions, always partially obscured. Searched deeper correspondence between lawyers. Language dense, careful words like liability settlement confidential. Me breath slowed, not from shock but from recognition. I had seen this tone before in contracts meant to make problems disappear. Realization came gradually, each piece fitting with a quiet certainty. Had not been given up. I had been transferred. There was a complication at my birth. Medical? Legal? Something that required distanciation instead of protection. There had been convenience. Me adoptive parents had not simply adopted a child. They had agreed to silence. Felt something shift inside my chest. Not breaking, hardening. They had stolen more than time, more than affection. They had stolen context. They had stolen my beginning. That night I sat across from them at dinner, watching them eat, watching them speak about ordinary things. He wondered how long they had carried this knowledge, how many times they had looked at me knowing I was a secret as much as a daughter. He wondered if they had ever been afraid, or if fear had been replaced by entitlement. Long agony adoptive mother laughed at something trivial. My adoptive father smiled. They looked at Easian. That was when I understood something essential. They believed they were safe because time had passed. Safe because I had needed them once. Safe because money had softened me. In their eyes they did not understand the difference between comfort and absolution. Over the next days, I traced the name further. Old records, archived articles, a legal firm that no longer existed. The woman had disappeared from public view shortly after my birth. No marriage records, no death records. Absence that thorough is never accidental. I felt no urge to cry. Grief requires innocence, and mine had been spent instead. I felt clarity. Everything in my life had been shaped by a decision made without me. A decision that prioritized ease over truth. I began to plan it. Revenge. Revenge is loud and temporary. What I wanted was exposure. The kind that does not shout, but lingers. In evening I asked my adoptive father about the year I was adopted. Casually, as if reminiscing, answered smoothly. Too smoothly. And nodded and said nothing. Silence stretched. He filled it with explanations, details I had not asked for. People who lie often mistake silence for confusion. Me adoptive mother watched us, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She knew she had always known. At night I wrote everything down: dates, names, connections. He understood then. This was not just my story, it was Thiersan's. Stories like this do not end quietly. Stories rewritten with affection and concern. In these versions, I had always been cherished, always supported, always encouraged. Wondered if repetition had made them believe it. At night, lay awake listening to the house settle, and thought about how easily narratives bend when money enters the room. He began to test them gently, mentioned the possibility of moving abroad. Just as an idea, just as a thought. Reaction was immediate. Me adoptive mother's face tightened, her hand gripped the edge of the table. Me adoptive father asked questions too many to fast. We so far, why now? What about family? Family words sounded strategically. Reassured them. I was only thinking. Their relief was visible, undeniable. Was when I knew they were not afraid of losing me. They were afraid of losing us. Chessie started spending more time outside the house, meeting with lawyers, accountants, people who spoke in numbers and contracts. He did not tell my adoptive parents everything, only enough to keep them uncertain. Uncertainty keeps people obedient. They asked if I needed help, connections, experience. He thanked them and declined politely. Unsettles people who expect control. One evening, my adoptive mother sat beside me, closer than usual. She spoke softly about regret, about mistakes, about how hard parenting can be. Never apologized. She spoke as if pain were an unavoidable accident, not a show. Say listened and said, nothing. Silence makes confession feel unfinished. Headlitter. That night, I returned to the studio, took photographs of the documents. Every page, every signature, every date. I learned names, companies, patterns. The story beneath. The story began to emerge. This was not just neglect. This was Dizini felt no urge to confront them. Yet revelations lose their power when delivered too early instead. I became what they wanted: gracious, successful, undemanding queen. They could be proud of and afraid of. They watched me closely, trying to anticipate my needs, my moods, my next move. They were learning how to please. I let them because I needed them. Comfortable, careless, convinced they had already want truth waits best in comfort, and I was patient. The more comfortable they became, the more careless the house grew. Carelessness leaves Trichesi began to notice details I had once been trained to ignore. A hesitation before certain names, a glance exchanged when specific years were mentioned. The way my adoptive father avoided speaking about hospitals, about paperwork, about the months surrounding my arrival. Did not ask directly. Direct questions triggered defense instead. I asked sideways. He asked about renovations that happened before I was adopted, about moves, about financial stress. During those years, my adoptive mother answered with vague warmth. My adoptive father answered with precision that felt rehearsed. Their answers did not match. Mismatch is where truth hides. Late one afternoon, while they were out, I returned to the study. This time with intent. He spread the documents across the desk. Photographs on my phone, notes in my Mind adoption records, medical references, legal letters, and then something small, almost insignificant, caught my attention. A name, not my adoptive parents, not Mani. A woman. Her name appeared once, then again, always followed by redactions, always partially obscurity. Searched correspondence between lawyers, language dense, careful words like liability settlement. Confidential. My breath slowed, not from shock but from recognition. I had seen this tone before in contracts meant to make problems disappear. Realization came gradually, each piece fitting with a quiet certainty. Had not been given up. I had been transferred. There was a complication at my birth. Medical, legal, something that required distanciation instead of protection. There had been convenience. My adoptive parents had not simply adopted a child. They had agreed to Silenci. Felt something shift inside my chest, not breaking, hardening. They had stolen more than time, more than affection. They had stolen context. They had stolen my beginning. That night, I sat across from them at dinner, watching them eat, watching them speak about ordinary things. I wondered how long they had carried this knowledge, how many times they had looked at me, knowing I was a secret. As much as a daughter, he wondered if they had ever been afraid, or if fear had been replaced by entitlement. Long Agami adoptive mother laughed at something trivial. My adoptive father smiled. They looked at Ezian. That was when I understood something essential. They believed they were safe because time had passed. Safe because I had needed them once. Safe because money had softened me in their eyes. They did not understand the difference between comfort and absolution. Over the next days, I traced the name further: old records, archived articles, a legal firm that no longer existed. The woman had disappeared from public view shortly after my birth. No marriage records, no death records. Absence that thorough is never accidental. I felt no urge to cry. Grief requires innocence, and mine had been spent instead. I felt clarity. Everything in my life had been shaped by a decision made without me, a decision that prioritized ease over truth. I began to plan it. Revenge. Revenge is loud and temporary. What I wanted was exposure, the kind that does not shout, but lingers. An evening, I asked my adoptive father about the year I was adopted. Casually, as if reminiscing, answered smoothly, too smoothly. I nodded and said nothing. Silence stretched. He filled it with explanations, details I had not asked for. People who lie often mistake silence for confusion. My adoptive mother watched us, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She knew. She had always known. At night, I wrote everything down: dates, names, connections. He understood then. This was not just my story, it was Thayersan's. Stories like this do not end quietly. I did not plan a confrontation. Confrontations are for people who want release. What I wanted was alignment. Every lie facing the truth. It had evaded. The opportunity came quietly, as these things always do. A dinner. Nothing special. No guests. Just the three of us at the table. The familiar setting, where I had once learned to measure every word. He waited until plates were half empty, until conversation had drifted into comfort, until they were least prepared. Then I asked a question, soft, almost careless. Do you remember the woman who handled my adoption? There changed, not dramatically, but enough. My adoptive father paused just long enough to matter which one. He asked. That was the answer. Before the Answeri nodded as if considering, then said the mammoth fork in my adoptive mother's hand. made a small sound against the plate metal touching porcelain. My adoptive father did not look at her. He looked at Mui. Are you a skingy? Took a breath long slow because her name appears in documents that do not belong to an adoption. Silence settled. Thick intentionally did not rush. Silence does the work if you let it. My adoptive mother spoke first. Her voice careful, almost gently. You have always had such an active imagination. I smiled. Not unkindled. Imagination does not come with bank transfers and confidentiality clauses. Color drained from her face. My adoptive father leaned back, his expression controlled, but his hands betrayed him, fingers tightening, loosening. What exactly do you think you found? He placed my phone on the table screen, facing up, photographs. Ready? Think you know? Another silence. Heavier. No, there were no raised voices, no accusations, only facts. Waiting. Finally, my adoptive father spoke. We did what was best. At the time, sentence felt old. Well, you said best for whom? I asked. He did not answer. My adoptive mother began to cry softly as if on question. Spoke about fear, about responsibility, about circumstances. She never spoke about Shoasei. Listened and understood that this was the most honest they could been it because they were incapable of more, but because more would require them to see themselves clearly. Told them what I knew piece by piece, not to shock but to confirm that there had been an agreement, that my history had been simplified, that silence had been purchased, that my identity had been negotiated. My adoptive father nodded slowly as if acknowledging a technicality. It was complicated. That word again, complicated, is what people say when the truth is inconvenient. He asked them why they never told me. My adoptive mother said she wanted to protect me from what I asked, from questions. She Sadie looked at her. Really looked. You protected yourself. The room did not resist the statement. It absorbed it. For the first time they did not deny. Me adoptive father spoke about legality, about closure, about how long it had been. Spoke as if time diluted responsibility. Did not argue arguments, suggest uncertainty. I told them I was not there to punish, not there to threaten. He was there to finish what had been left unfinished. Told them I would be finding the rest of the story with or without their cooperation. I told them the money had given me access, but the truth had given me direction. Me adoptive mother asked if I was going to leave. Agant question surprised me, not because it was unexpected, but because it was Honsti's. I said, but not because of this, because I have my name. No, they did not stop me. They did not apologize. They watched and in their watching I saw something like understanding, not regret, not remorse, but recognition. They had mistaken possession for permanence. That night I packed calmly, deliberate, nothing rushed, nothing forgotten. As I stood in the doorway, the same doorway years apart, felt no akunli completion. I left before dawn, the house still holding its breath as if unsure whether it was allowed to exhale without me. There outside was cool, clean, and different. Carried only what mattered: documents, notes, the small weight of truth I had gathered piece by piece. No photographs, no souvenirs, no borrowed memories. Some places do not deserve nostalgia. As the car moved forward, the road unfolded like a sentence finally allowed. Dendi thought about the girl who had run once, afraid, hungry, uncertain. She had believed escape was freedom. No, I knew better. Freedom is a thorship. He traveled toward the coast again, not to hide but to begin. The sea was the same, endless. Unimpressed by human arrangements, he rented a small room above a closed cafe, the kind of place where mornings are quiet and evenings. Listini spread the documents across the bed, the past and the present touching for the first time without supervision. He contacted lawyers, historians, people who know how to read. Absenthe name of the woman surfaced again, not loudly but consistently. Patterns emerged, a timeline, a network of decisions that explained the silence around my birth. She had not disappeared. She had been erased politically, not with violence but with agreement. He learned that she had fought briefly, ineffectively. Learned that the settlement included distance, and that distance had been enforced not by law but by pressure. Pressure is harder to prove, easier to deny. Weeks passed, then months. He did not chase closure. Closure is a performance. He chased accuracy. Eventually a lead appeared, a village inland, a woman living under a different surname, with eyes described as familiari. When Alaneath Road narrowed, the landscape softened as if preparing. Mesh opened the door herself. Time had shaped her gently. Lines earned, not imposed. She did not ask who I was, looked and knew names matter, but recognition is older than language. You sat without urgency, without script. She told me the truth she was allowed to tell, and some she had carried along. There were tears, but they were not the center. The center was continuity. Did not gain a mother that day. I gained a Regan when I left. She pressed her hand to my chest as if feeling for something steady. You were never lost, she suddenly Delayed in the drive back, I realized something importante was not returning to anyone. I was moving forward with contexty, did not expose my adoptive parents, not publicize them. Truths are sharper when left intact with Tingy, did not forgive them. Forgiveness requires a request. He wrote my story not to accuse, but to document it. Everything needs justice. Some things need record. The flower shop by the sea reopened. Larger, brighter people asked about the change. I smiled and arranged another bouquet. Flowers grow where they are. Alouette no longer run. I no longer perform gratitude. I no longer borrow. Now messy, keep my own, and that finally is enough.